1 month and 1 day since Hamas last released hostages. Many a hope's been raised and dashed since. And until a deal is done, Israel continues with its pounding of the Gaza Strip, Gaza, where an estimated half the buildings in the north are either damaged or destroyed. So what would a release look like? Hamas badly wants a truce. Israel, the return of more than 200 civilians abducted on October 7th. We'll ask about the mediators and the players. Ismail Haniyeh is the face of Hamas abroad, but who's calling the shots inside of Gaza? Does Israel's leadership want to negotiate or eliminate its interlocutors? Would a 3 or 4 or 5 day truce signal a temporary respite, or the first step towards spelling out an alternative to reducing all of Gaza to rubble? That raises the broader question. If Hamas's aim on October 7th was to spark a reaction, they sure got it. Now what? What's the ultimate goal for Palestinians? What's the ultimate goal for Israelis? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what's the deal? And joining us from Jerusalem is correspondent Jordana Miller. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, Francois.
From Ann Arbor, Michigan, former U.S. State Department official Jeffrey Stacey's a U.S. national security consultant. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on the hashtag F24debate. Now, there's definitely movement. The chair of Hamas's political bureau, Ismail Haniyeh, asserting that officials were close to reaching a truce agreement with Israel, and that the group has delivered its response to Qatari mediators. That's according to the Reuters news agency. Meanwhile, as we speak, a war cabinet followed by a full cabinet for Israel's government. That's also taking place after earlier the prime minister took a stroll and in a photo op with soldiers talked up prospects.
The return of hostages. We are making progress. I don't think it's worth saying too much, not even at this moment, but I hope there will be good news soon.
Jordana Miller, what's the latest?
Well, the latest is that Netanyahu's war cabinet and later the security cabinet and his government are expected to discuss a hostage deal and then vote on it this evening, possibly into the morning. But it appears that Israel is now moving to a very critical step of officially approving this deal. In the best case scenario, it would happen overnight, and then tomorrow there would be a 24-hour waiting period in which anyone who would contest the prisoner exchange or hostage release deal would be able to say so, and perhaps the Supreme Court, if needed, would step in to defend it. But the broad outlines of this deal look like Israel would agree to a 4 to 5 day ceasefire in return for the release of at least 50 Israeli hostages, women and children primarily. But we're also hearing reports now that there would also be some of the elderly hostages released and some of the sick. Israel would also allow in 300 trucks of aid a day, as well as fuel. And in Israel would release Palestinian female prisoners, jailed Palestinians and minors. We don't know who they are yet, but it looks like about 150 of them will be released. None of them, we're told, have quote unquote blood on their hands. They haven't been convicted of murder. So those are the broad parameters. Once this deal passes, and we do expect it to pass, even though it will be opposed by some of the far-right leaders in Netanyahu's government, then we will learn the exact details. But again, 4 to 5 days of a ceasefire, 50 Israelis, and they will be released in bunches, that is 10 per day.
So 10 per day over 4 or 5 days, and a lot can scuttle the deal. What families fear is that Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right coalition partners, even if they do, as you say, fall in line, will still nonetheless throw fuel on the fire, as they did on Monday. Shirley Sitbon has that story.
The statement from Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh that a deal is closer than ever brings some hope to hostages' families. On Monday, they continued their struggle, meeting with government officials, some voicing concern about the Israeli cabinet's priorities.
What we've heard is that taking down Hamas and bringing the hostages are as important, are equally important. This is incredibly disappointing because I feel that at this point, when we know that taking down Hamas, we keep hearing from them, is going to take months or years, and it's going to take a long time. On the other hand, the other objective is time sensitive. People are dying.
Hours earlier, several families begged far-right lawmakers to drop a debate on the death penalty for terrorists.
I think the death penalty is a must, so that events such as the one we've had will not repeat themselves in the future.
But the families said the debate could endanger the lives of their loved ones.
All that comes out of this house is heard over on the other side. If, God forbid, the crazy, Nazis, psychopaths, everything you say about them will use it against the hostages to harm them, their blood will be on your hands, and yours, and all of you.
A deal over the release of some 50 hostages, maybe more, likely children and women, would, according to media reports, include several days of ceasefire, the entry of more humanitarian aid, including fuel, and the release of dozens of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, mainly minors and women. On Monday, Qatar and U.S. President Joe Biden confirmed a deal is in the cards.
So the fault lines are there. Jeffrey Stacey, we were speaking earlier with our senior correspondent, James Andre, who was telling us that it's basically what's your priority? Is it number one, eradicating Hamas, or is number one, saving the hostages? What's your sense in what the Israeli government's top priority of those two is?
Well, it does appear that they have been prioritizing the military objectives over the political objectives, and that's why they are losing with certainty the international public opinion, which is so crucial in the United States, the polling, and throughout Europe and elsewhere, across the Middle East, etc. So you have a political clock that is ticking faster than the military clock, as it were. And we still don't have any indication that the Israelis have thought through, what comes next. But this is very positive. And all leaders on both sides have to be commended for getting to yes, in the sense that this ceasefire and this exchange is overdue, as well as all the humanitarian aid, etc. But it does appear that other things are lacking, such as a crackdown on extremist settler activity. And, of course, we have a very complicated Hamas leadership that is spread across borders, across almost continents, if you will. And that has complicated things. The fact that even handwritten notes are being passed, you can't... Well, Hamas is not even using radio communications. And so that is why all of this is taking more time than it otherwise would.
Jeffrey, I want to get into why it is that how Hamas works in a moment. But first, let me just follow up on something you said a moment ago, that, because we are on the edge of, perhaps on the brink of some kind of an agreement. If there is a ceasefire, what happens after? Is that the place where you can maybe extend that ceasefire, or will it just be a short lull and that's it?
Well, right now, the Israeli government is implacably opposed to any permanent ceasefire or any extension, anything of the kind. But things can change. And we've already seen that the American, Qatari pressure, and from others, has had an impact on even this government. So we expect, for example, that we'll see a potential breakthrough in the political thinking and as well as the military thinking on the Israeli side and on the Hamas side.
Just for a minute, Jeffrey, I'm going to interrupt you. We're going to cross over and listen to the Israeli military spokesperson and see what he has to say.
בהם גם חיילי צה"ל, שנחטפו על ידי ארגון טרור אכזר ומוחזקים כעת בעזה. נעשה הכל, להשיבם מהר ככל האפשר.
All right, we do not have translations for that. Apologies. Let me ask you, Jordana Miller. That's the daily briefing we're witnessing of the Israeli military. A word on what you just heard from Jeffrey, particularly in the context of those divisions within Israeli society and Israel's government, even. Jordana Miller? We seem to have lost the audio connection. Let's see if we can reconnect. Can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Okay, you're back. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was going to say I wanted to pick up on one comment there that Jeffrey made about the hostages, and really from watching everything unfold here and knowing the political divisions that exist here, I would say that the families, the way they organized themselves, the way that they were able to, talk about their cause and their stories and their pain to the media, really became a political liability for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's not entirely clear that from the get-go, returning the hostages was going to even be equal to the war aims of destroying Hamas, and even later pull ahead a little bit. I think a lot of that was influenced by the public and the public outrage that somehow these innocent civilians were taken hostage in such a ferocious and cruel way, and that the Israeli government and its army failed them dramatically, spectacularly on October 7th, that they demanded that the government make the return of their loved ones that at the top of the list of the priorities. And then, Netanyahu is somebody who's always concerned about his base, his popularity numbers. Somehow he still believes he can hold on to power. We can talk about that later.
Which he's done after 46 days, Jordana.
Yeah.
And so the question is, at that cabinet meeting that's taking place, if the far right uses the kind of rhetoric we saw in that report earlier, and stands their ground, you're saying they probably will fall in line, but it's not a certainty.
It won't really matter, Francois. If they say that if they vote even against this, it won't matter. They can't scuttle the deal that needs a majority by the government and the cabinet. And most of them are not even, none of them are in the war cabinet itself. So they may protest loudly, speaking to their base. In the end, this deal is going to go through, and it is what I was trying to say before is that I think it's really due to the credit of the families that made this such a huge issue, and that we're seeing this deal go through. Certainly the leaders wanted to bring home the hostages, but it really became the most important thing over the last 2 weeks, because there are 40 children that Hamas is holding, a 10-month-old toddler. I mean, the outrage here, after the sadness and the grief passed, the outrage and the anger grew day after day after day.
He's joined our conversation throughout the last 6 weeks off, and I want to welcome you, Hussein Ibish from Washington, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Good to see you, Francois.
Listening to Jordana Miller there, After 6 weeks, would you say Benjamin Netanyahu is stronger or weaker?
I think he's weaker overall. I don't think he's been able to do two things that really would help him a lot. One thing is working for him, but first, I think he's still laboring under the stigma of the failures of governance and of security that were evident on October 7th and 8th and 9th. It took the Israeli security forces about 3 days to get fully in control of these areas of southern Israel. And I think that people in Israel were shocked, not just at the brazenness of the Hamas attack and its efficacy and its ruthlessness, its viciousness, but also the fact that their security forces were not there for them. And they kind of felt, I think people in southern Israel at least felt a little bit stateless. Like maybe they had a bit of a Palestinian experience. They thought they had a government and an army, et cetera, to protect them, and for at least for 48 hours. And plus, they really didn't have one. And that, I think, was a big shock. So that he's still laboring under that. The second thing is that he doesn't have any answer as to the end game. He's all over the map. No, Israel must stay. No, Israel doesn't want to stay. Well, Hamas must be destroyed. Well, no, but Hamas, we'll just degrade Hamas so it won't be a threat. He's flailing because Israel had to
flailing or buying time?
Both, because that brings us to the third point, which is I think he's concluded that the best way for him to stay out of prison is to stay in power. We know that. And now the best way to stay in power is to keep the conflict going. So I don't see Netanyahu as somebody who's looking for a way out of the conflict. Now, luckily, Israel is not, kind of a dictatorial system or a presidential system where one man makes all the decisions. There's a war cabinet. And there are others who have a lot of say here. And the United States has a huge influence. I think that was crucial in keeping Israel from launching a preemptive strike against Hezbollah in the early days of this. So the last thing that's going for him is the fact that this could be a very long process, and it will be much harder to get rid of him if the war is still going on in its main phase than if it's seen as somehow transitioning towards a post-conflict scenario.
Jeffrey Stacey, do you agree that there with Hussein that the United States has a lot of influence? It hasn't stopped the settlers attacking Palestinians in the West Bank. You alluded to that earlier. The U.S. also has hostages. Joe Biden has refrained from any public criticism of the Israeli Prime Minister's actions. Does the U.S. have influence?
Well, it does, and you're seeing it in the readiness of this deal. In other words, President Biden and his team needed to be fulsome in their support of Israel to buy additional leverage, and now they're using that leverage. But inside the United States here, the dissent over all of this is growing, and it's even getting to the point where there are worries about Biden's reelection from young people and particularly Arab Americans, such as in Dearborn, Michigan. But you've got a situation where at least the U.S. is using that influence fairly successfully. And the red lines that Israel has, that Netanyahu has, are changing because of that pressure that is also coming from Qatar and others. And that's good. So we're on the eve of a very important period, and lots will likely change in the course of these 5 days. And that's a good thing, because the more change, the better. Israelis are willing to allow Netanyahu to stick around as long as the major part of the war operation is underway still, but not a day longer.
So let me ask you, right now in the last minutes, there's been the U.S. State Department stating that the hostage deal, everything is not final, but we are close. The Israeli's chief military spokesperson, who you saw earlier on screen, saying there's progress, but wait till the details are final. If you were a betting man, Jeffrey Stacey, what are the final details to iron out?
Well, I'm betting that we'll have a deal shortly.
But what puts it over the line?
Well, whether or not it's going to go for 4 days or 5 days, how many hostages released per day, exactly how the hostages will be transferred, other guarantees from the backers of this, et cetera, et cetera. But the details are, well, you can't say they're less important than just getting the deal because the two are utterly intertwined. They're essentially the same. But you see where I'm headed here in terms of the logic. There's overwhelming pressure from all sides now and acceptance, even internally in the war cabinet, that there will be a deal. So we're over the toughest hurdle. And now we have a smaller hurdle to iron out the details. So this will happen. I think we can bet on it. But then the crucial thing is what one of my colleagues just alluded to a few minutes ago, which is everything that comes next. And here we have, yes, a cabinet and a prime minister who are all over the place. And I suspect, I will predict this too, and even put money on this, that there will be a transition to a Palestinian Authority, et cetera, et cetera. But much has to happen before that. We should see plenty of changed minds in the course of these 5 days of the ceasefire. And then there'll be immense international pressure to wind up the military operation once it starts again. And that's where you're going to see immense American pressure to contain the extremist activity of the settlers and other things. And the humanitarian aid shipments will have to go up. There'll have to be an extra vetting, possibly even of the American aid that's going in. All kinds of things will then stack up in terms of what next will be on the agenda.
Speaking about what's
So,
going on now, Jordana Miller, go ahead.
I just want to say on this point, I totally disagree with you, Jeffrey. I think Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been very insistent that the goals of this war are to push Hamas out of the Gaza Strip, kill their leaders, dismantle their military assets, get them off Israel's border. And I don't believe, even for 1 minute, that the ceasefire that, God willing, we will see and the hostages that we will see released, I do not think it will lead to any discussions of a long-term ceasefire or possible end to this war. Israel still has several stages of this war. The next one to go south to Khan Yunis, which is still a Hamas stronghold, where Hamas leaders are believed to be hiding. And that will be the next part of this war for Israel. And I think it's very likely that Israel and the United States are on the same page that the war will resume after 5 days. In fact, I don't even believe that Israel would have agreed to this ceasefire unless they knew the Americans were going to let them go into the second stage of the war.
Yes.
You know, we have to understand there was such a dramatic paradigm shift after this attack, where Netanyahu really, he was the architect of a policy that said, you know what, we can keep Hamas quiet, we can appease them with, we can give them money, we can let more workers come in, we can have little flare-ups now and then, but ultimately we can live with Hamas. And conveniently for him, he believed it would split the Palestinian people, prevent him from having to deal with the conflict, resolving the conflict. And that all blew up on October 7th. And, you know, and not only among the political leadership, but all of the defense leaders who also had bought into that very misguided conception, which led to many of the errors, the intel errors. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think Israel now is so determined to finish this war that this ceasefire for 4 or 5 days
But
is
can
not
you
going
finish
to
this
derail
war,
that.
Jordana?
I think
Can you finish it?
think
Because all Hamas has to do is have one senior commander come out of a hole when it's all over and say, "I'm still alive," and Israel's lost.
Yep.
Well, that's where we get into the discussion of what will happen, you know, at the end of this war, post-war. And by the way, there are certain areas where Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden, you know, they don't talk about it publicly, but there's daylight on how long this war will be. and what will
Yes.
come after it, right? So Netanyahu he may, for his own political reasons, as we've said earlier, may want a long war, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. The United States is clearly not interested in a war all for that length of time. You know, President Biden wants to win re-election. The election is not far off now, and it seems most likely that the United States is going to give Israel a green light until January 1st, a little bit longer, 2 months, 3 months, and then Israel will have to, and I believe, have to wrap up this war. And so
Yes.
I think as long as Israel has America's backing to continue the fighting, they will continue the fighting.
So Hussein Ibish, this is just a small respite.
Yeah, I think for sure. But I think it's interesting because I think the U.S. really pressed for this. And one of the reasons they did is it sets a precedent. It means that Israel can stop for X amount of time. And once you've established that, then you've set the stage for more sustained ceasefires. And in fact, this is part two, right? Because we already had the pauses, the humanitarian pauses that went on for a couple of hours every day to try to bring in the little supplies that have been allowed in. Now we have this hostages deal. By the way, the sticking point probably is fuel more than anything else at this point. I believe the biggest sticking point is fuel being provided to Gaza. But any accommodation in Gaza would help Hamas. So, you know, it's one of these things where you can't find a perfect model. But here's the thing. I agree that there's some kind of time frame like that, like early to mid-January, possibly late January, that Israel has to wrap up. Now, let's ask ourselves the question: what does that mean, right? I think Israel's put itself in a situation with its unachievable war aim of destroying Hamas, where they have to provide Hamas with one of two victories, either a little victory, a fake victory, or a big real victory. The little victory would be doing damage until sometime in January and leaving and letting Hamas crawl out of the rubble and declare a Pyrrhic, hollow, divine victory that would be totally empty. Or Israel can stay and institute a kind of long-term reoccupation and then sort of say they've destroyed Hamas. And that's when Hamas gets its big victory. Its big victory would be a reoccupation against which it can launch a long-term insurgency, and that's what they want.
And it's a bit confusing for our viewers, Hussein, because on the one hand they're negotiating. We talked about the notes being passed. We've seen Ismail Haniyeh, the chief of their political bureau, who's in Qatar. There's probably back-channel discussions that go all the way to the Hamas commander in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar. So again, it's that question: are you negotiating? Or are you trying to eradicate your interlocutors?
Yeah, exactly. And what this points out is the incoherence in this Hamas delenda est slogan that Israel embraced, that wrote Hamas's victory speech for it in advance. What I think people need to understand is that Hamas' main aim here is about taking over the Palestinian national movement. Hamas has its eye on its principal prime directive since its founding, which is to take the Palestinian national movement and make it an Islamist one, not a secular nationalist one, to get Fatah out, take over the PLO, and become the national movement. They were really losing momentum in doing that. But by ginning up this war, I think the idea is to present themselves over the long run, not so much in this initial battle that they know they'll lose, but either through coming out of the rubble and declaring victory, or even better, staying and fighting the Israelis every day in the streets of Khan Yunis and Rafah and Gaza City and what have you, and say, we are the national movement. We are the ones who fight the occupation and the occupying soldiers over control of Palestinian land every day. You guys in the West Bank sit there doing nothing. We are the national movement. And that's what I think this is ultimately all about.
And we saw that back in August, there was the Lebanon-based deputy head of Hamas who appeared dressed in military fatigues, something of a rarity for Saleh Al-Houri. Hindsight being 2020, Jordana Miller, one Israeli analyst, has been saying that this was actually a sign to the likes of Yahya Sinwar that we've got more muscle if you don't.
Right. Well, I think Israel missed, a lot of signs because, Hamas has been putting out very belligerent statements for months and months. And, Israel fundamentally misread the enemy, both in their capacity, their capacity to plan and train and carry out a very large scale attack. I mean, Hamas succeeded, in quotes, in killing 1,200 Israelis in a matter of several hours. That is the highest number of Jews killed since the Second World War, and doing it in ways that echoed the gruesome and brutal murders of the Nazi regime. Again, though, I still disagree with Hussein. I still think that even if Israel has to be reoccupied temporarily the Gaza Strip for a year or 2 years, it will do it until it feels there is either the Palestinian Authority, does some house cleaning and can take over the Gaza Strip, or a consortium.
Is that what public opinion? Is that what public
do.
opinion in Israel wants, or is that just simply the hard right that Benjamin Netanyahu's in coalition with?
I think most of the Israeli public is behind a war that, even if it takes, again, a year of reoccupying the Gaza Strip temporarily, I think most Israelis are behind that war. And I want to explain again because of the cruelty and the shock of that attack, because some of the people who were taken captive were peace activists, right, who worked with the Palestinians and Gazans. Somehow, Israel had to look in the face the enemy and realize that there is no way to coexist with this leadership. There is just no way. So, Israelis feel that they have to stand behind Netanyahu. And by the way, this really isn't Netanyahu's war. This is General Benny Gantz's war. This is Eisenkotz, the other general in the war cabinet. This is the defense minister's war. This is the people's war. People have almost no faith really in Netanyahu. But given the trauma of October 7th, they couldn't possibly think of switching leaders right now. But Netanyahu will be discarded the day that this is over.
That's right.
Jeffrey Stacey, your thoughts on again, just to pick up on what Jordana and Hussein were saying, and that you were talking at the beginning of that there's a lack of an endgame on the part of the current Israeli government. What do you see developing, though?
Well, I think what we're going to see is additional pressure brought to bear. And even though Netanyahu's basically said over and over again, the Palestinian Authority will not be in power in governance terms in the Strip, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. What we'll see is somewhere around early in the new year, hopefully, finally, we'll see some sort of international trusteeship led by the UN and effectively a major ceasefire. And at that point, we expect that not only will Netanyahu's days be numbered politically at that point, but there will be essentially enormous pressure coming from all sides, especially international public opinion, to transition to governance that is not the Israeli Defense Forces. So that's where we're headed, but we have a lot to go through on the way. And of course, the U.S. is expecting that this 5-day ceasefire will be just that, and that the IDF will go back to its military operations. Absolutely, but everything is now delimited. And what you have in bigger terms, which I think is more important, Francois, to think of the bigger picture here, both sides have made a giant gamble, and both leaders have lost this gamble. I don't think that Hamas will be successful in its longer term aspirations to essentially take charge of everything politically over time, because they too have really overplayed their hand. They were too brutal, and the cost has been too great, and most of the operation and certainly the military part of it will be dismantled and eliminated. And yet, it's not quite likely to be the case that they can transfer that into enough opinion in the Arab world and in the refugee camps and across, the West Bank, that somehow miraculously all eyes will turn to the living Hamas leadership. So I don't think that's really on the cards. By the same token, the Israelis have overplayed their hand, and Netanyahu and his war cabinet and this extreme coalition, they've gambled and they've lost. So we'll see over time. Israeli political opinion will not just discard Netanyahu, but several of these other leaders. And we heard a comment from one of the most extreme earlier in the program. Their days are also looking to be numbered. And here it's going to be very important for Qatar, for the US, for the Europeans and others to ride herd, as it were, and ensure that there is a transition to an acceptable political entity. And then, wow, Mahmoud Abbas and those around him are going to have their work cut out for them, because they have not really performed adequately in the past, and they're going to have to now. Otherwise, my colleague is going to be correct. Hamas will have made the right bet, but there'll be a lot of aid to that authority. And at some point, then the bigger questions will have to return about two-state solutions
and a broader peace deal. Hussein Ibish, let me just ask you, because earlier you talked about Hamas's endgame, which was to take control of all of the Palestinian leadership. We've had on the program representatives of the Palestinian Authority, loath under the circumstances with so many civilians being killed, to directly criticize Hamas on camera. It's, for them, it's not the moment. What do you think will be Hamas's legitimacy in a month's time, in 2 months' time?
So it totally depends, right? There's a scenario that we've seen in Lebanon in 2006 when there was a great rallying around the flag when Hezbollah went to war with Israel. And almost all the Lebanese were sort of supportive of Hezbollah, including their long enemies and things. But when the dust settled, Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, had to go on television and apologize for the damage that was wrought by the Israelis, and claiming he had no idea what would happen, as if anyone in Lebanon had any doubts by 2006 about Israel's doctrine of disproportionality. Of course he knew. It was a silly lie, but he told it anyway. Now, that could happen to Hamas, but only if the Israelis leave. If the Israelis stay, then I think Hamas gets what it wants. Now, here's the problem with all these scenarios that both of my colleagues here have been talking about, is they're assuming something that doesn't exist, which is another force other than Israel or Hamas that can and will rule in Gaza. I believe this beast does not exist. I don't know what it is. The Palestinian Authority will be loath to come in on the back of an Israeli tank. The only way to get them to do it would be to revive the two-state process, not in the distant future, but right up front. In other words, you would have to change, Israel would have to fundamentally change its policies towards the Palestinian national movement and abandon divide and rule, which they've been following for more than 20 years, and empower the Palestinian Authority and the PLO and get back into real two-state negotiations as a basic condition for the PA going back into Gaza. They're not going to do it otherwise, because the political damage of going in on the back of Israeli tanks is unbelievable. And the idea of a multinational force or a UN force or anything, is crazy. Who is going to want to voluntarily take control of these 2.1 million people in a devastation left by Israel, to pay for this, to organize it, and probably be the target of the insurgency that Hamas is planning anyway? I don't think Palestinians would be spared, let alone UN peacekeepers or an Arab group or anything like that. This is fantastical stuff. So I really do think at the end of the day, we're back to the fact that Israel either stays or goes.
Jeffrey Stacey?
Right.
Well, first of all, an international force is not going to be targeted by Hamas militarily, and they're not going to be paying for it either. That will basically end up having to partly come from Israel. The pressure will be immense, and the pressure will be coming directly from Washington, from C.Q. Brown, from President Biden, and from Lloyd Austin and others, Tony Blinken in particular. So that pressure will be intense, and in fact, you have already we've seen the Israelis move, and so there will have to be some sort of transition that will allow. My friend is correct that Abbas said the quote that he used, that he won't ride in on a tank, and we understand why. But it will be tough. He's right that the Israelis will be loath to commit to a peace process started in the short term, in the immediate future. And that's where the rub is going to be. That's where the pressure coming from the Qataris, from the Americans and the Europeans will have to be instrumental. But this bodes well, because we're seeing Israel back down and agree to things that it said previously it wouldn't. Red lines are moving as we speak. Let's not be overly optimistic. Let's not be fantastical. Let's ride herd.
Yeah, red lines.
Listen,
red lines are moving.
There is a situation which I think many Israelis would embrace, where after this war, in some kind of interim period, when Netanyahu is gone, there is a new leadership here that is serious about reviving real peace talks that could now include the Gaza Strip and the West Bank together. This is where Hamas actually, I disagree that Israel kind of is overplaying their card. They feel they were forced into this war, and Netanyahu, by the way, is been conservative on war his entire time in office. That's part of the reason we got to this point. If he had taken a hard stand against Hamas in its early years, we may have never come to this point. But Hamas, they will lose this war, but they will do something that Israelis couldn't do, and that is finally get Netanyahu out, and finally, perhaps, a real meaningful peace process, and the reason for it will become aware to Israelis, even in the center right. And by the way, the Hamas also, killed the judicial overhaul and the extremists who will have, I'm not sure these right-wing leaders, they will ever have a role again in Israeli politics for the next decade after this.
All right, there's a prediction. We're going to end it there, unfortunately. That's a big one. Jordana Miller, many thanks for joining us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Hussein Ibish in Washington, Jeffrey Stacey in Ann Arbor. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.